It was a regular afternoon when Special Agent Natasha King, a highly trained FBI agent, left her office. After closing a major case that had dominated her schedule for weeks, she decided to take a rare break and enjoy a quiet evening in her neighborhood. Before we start, don't forget to subscribe to my channel. Dressed in casual clothes, jeans, a fitted jacket, and sneakers, Natasha looked like any other woman running errands. But under the surface, she was a seasoned law enforcement professional. As she walked toward her favorite cafe, a police cruiser pulled up behind her. Natasha noticed the car, but kept walking, not thinking much of it. Moments later, she heard the car slow down, and a voice called out. "Excuse me, ma'am," said a white police officer, stepping out of the car, his hand resting on his gun holster. Natasha turned around, and instantly, she could feel the officer's suspicious gaze on her. She had encountered this before. Racial profiling, even though she herself was law enforcement, but this time, the officer had no idea who he was dealing with. Natasha King had spent the last 3 weeks working around the clock. As an FBI agent, she specialized in cybercrime and had just wrapped up a complex case involving a large, international hacking ring. The case had been a major win for her and her team, but it left her exhausted. Today was supposed to be her chance to unwind. She had decided to take a leisurely walk down her neighborhood's quiet streets, on her way to grab some coffee and clear her mind. Dressed down in her favorite black leather jacket, jeans, and comfortable sneakers, Natasha blended in with the casual crowd of the neighborhood. The last thing she expected was trouble. But trouble was exactly what she found. As Natasha walked down the street, a police cruiser drove slowly past her, the officer inside glancing at her through his window. She felt his gaze linger on her, but she brushed it off. She wasn't doing anything wrong, after all. Just as she approached the cafe, the cruiser pulled up alongside her and stopped. A white officer, tall and stocky, got out of the vehicle. His expression was hard to read behind his sunglasses, but his posture immediately put Natasha on guard. She had been in law enforcement long enough to recognize when someone was trying to assert authority over her. "Ma'am," the officer called out, stepping toward her, his hand casually resting on his gun belt. "I need to ask you a few questions." Natasha stopped and turned to face him, her instincts kicking in. She had dealt with situations like this before, but it was always unsettling when it happened. Being black, even as a federal agent, didn't shield her from racial profiling. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked, her voice calm but firm. The officer sized her up, his eyes flicking from her hair, neatly braided, down to her shoes. Natasha remained composed, waiting for his next move. "We've had reports of a suspicious person in the area," the officer said, his tone clipped and professional. "I need to see some identification." Natasha's eyes narrowed. She knew exactly where this was going. She wasn't doing anything suspicious, just walking down the street. But she also knew that refusing to cooperate could escalate the situation quickly. Still, the irritation bubbled under the surface. "Suspicious?" Natasha repeated, arching an eyebrow. "I'm just grabbing a coffee." The officer didn't budge. His hand stayed close to his weapon, and his expression remained hard. "ID, please?" he said again, this time more forcefully. Natasha's patience was already wearing thin, but as a trained FBI agent, she knew how to handle these situations. She slowly pulled out her wallet and handed him her driver's license, keeping her FBI badge concealed for the moment. She wanted to see just how far this officer was willing to go. The officer glanced at the license, then back at her. Suspicion still etched across his face. "You live around here?" he asked, his tone accusatory. Natasha clenched her jaw. She knew what he was implying, that she didn't look like she belonged in this neighborhood. But she wasn't about to give him the satisfaction of reacting. "Yes," she said evenly. "I live a few blocks away." The officer's eyes lingered on her, clearly doubting her words. He was fishing for something, and Natasha could feel the tension in the air. But she wasn't going to make it easy for him. "Attorney, huh?" the officer said, reading the occupation listed on her license. "How does someone like you afford a place around here?" Natasha felt a sharp sting of anger at his words. "Someone like you." She had heard that phrase before, always tinged with racism, always assuming she didn't belong. But she kept her expression neutral. "I work hard for it," she replied, her voice cold. The officer smirked, handing her license back, but he didn't move away. Instead, he stepped closer, his body language turning more aggressive. "You know," he said, lowering his voice, "you match the description of someone we're looking for. A suspect in a robbery last week. Same build, same height." Natasha's heartbeat quickened. She knew what he was doing, trying to intimidate her, trying to provoke her into making a mistake. But she wasn't just any civilian. She was a federal agent, and she knew exactly how to handle this. "I haven't committed any crime," she said firmly. The officer's hand twitched near his radio. He was getting ready to escalate the situation. "We're going to need to take a little trip down to the station," he said, raising his voice, "just to clear things up." Natasha's eyes flashed with irritation, but she remained composed. She wasn't going to let this officer drag her anywhere. "Officer," she said, her voice controlled, "I know my rights. I haven't done anything wrong, and unless you have probable cause, I'm not going anywhere." The officer's expression darkened. He wasn't used to being challenged like this, especially by a black woman. Natasha could see the anger building in his eyes. "You think you're smarter than me?" he sneered, taking another step toward her. "You think you can just walk away from this?" Natasha remained unfazed. She had dealt with far worse than this in her line of work. But before she could respond, she heard another voice cut through the tension. "Is there a problem here?" Natasha and the officer both turned to see a tall black man in a tailored suit walking toward them. He held a briefcase in one hand, and his expression was calm but serious. Natasha didn't recognize him, but something about his presence was reassuring. The officer, however, didn't seem pleased by the interruption. "This doesn't concern you," the officer snapped. "Move along." The man raised an eyebrow and reached into his pocket, pulling out a sleek black leather badge holder. He flipped it open, revealing his credentials. "I'm with the FBI," the man said coolly. "And actually, this does concern me." The officer's bravado immediately faltered. His eyes darted between the FBI agent and Natasha, suddenly unsure of himself. The situation had just escalated in a way he hadn't anticipated. The man in the suit stepped closer, flashing Natasha a quick, reassuring smile before turning his attention back to the officer. "Why are you detaining this woman?" the agent asked, his tone professional but icy. "She hasn't committed a crime, has she?" The officer fumbled for words, clearly rattled. No. But she matches the description of a suspect in a recent robbery," he stammered, trying to regain control of the situation. The FBI agent's eyes narrowed, and he glanced at Natasha, his gaze sharp. "And yet, you didn't arrest her, so you must not have any evidence." The officer hesitated, his authority slipping away with every second. "I was just doing my job." Natasha could no longer remain silent. She took a step forward, her voice calm but firm. "You were profiling me," she said bluntly. "You saw a black woman in a nice neighborhood and assumed I didn't belong. But you made a mistake." She reached into her jacket, revealing her own FBI badge. The officer's face drained of color as he realized what was happening. "I'm a federal agent," Natasha continued, her voice cold. "And you just violated my civil rights." The officer's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. He was caught, and he knew it. The male FBI agent crossed his arms, his expression hardening. "I think it's time you leave," he said to the officer, his voice leaving no room for argument, "before you find yourself in a lot more trouble." The officer quickly nodded, his confidence completely shattered. He muttered an apology before retreating to his cruiser and driving away. As the police cruiser disappeared down the street, Natasha let out a slow breath, the adrenaline still pumping through her veins. She turned to the other FBI agent, who was watching her with a calm, professional demeanor. "Thanks for stepping in," she said, slipping her badge back into her jacket. The man smiled warmly. "No problem. I could tell things were getting out of hand." Natasha nodded, feeling a sense of relief wash over her. It wasn't the first time she had been racially profiled, and it probably wouldn't be the last. But today, she had been reminded that she wasn't alone. She had the power to fight back, and she had allies who would stand with her. The man extended his hand. "Special Agent Marcus Reed." "Special Agent Natasha King," she replied, shaking his hand. Marcus smiled, glancing down the street. "Do you mind if I join you for that coffee? I could use a break myself." Natasha chuckled. "I'd appreciate the company." As they walked toward the cafe together, Natasha couldn't help but reflect on the day's events. She knew that the fight against racism and discrimination was far from over, even within law enforcement. But today had shown her something important. Change was possible. People like Marcus Reed, and even herself, were part of that change. She wasn't going to let the actions of one bigoted officer define her or hold her back. She was stronger than that, and she would continue to fight for justice, both for herself and for those who couldn't fight for themselves. As Natasha sat across from Marcus at the cafe sipping her coffee, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. Being an FBI agent wasn't just about catching criminals, it was about standing up for what was right, even when it wasn't easy. The world was full of injustice, but people like her had the power to change things. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but she was ready for whatever came next. Because Natasha King wasn't just any FBI agent. She was a fighter for justice, equality, and the truth. And no one, not even a prejudiced police officer, could take that away from her.